Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in to today's webinar. Digitalization poses great demands on the leadership of organizations. And has your organization actually mastered these challenges? And if not, you belong to the majority of organizations. My name is Friederike Reda, and I'm very happy Professor Heike Bruch, she's a professor at the Institute of Leadership and HR Management, will be joining me. She will join us from Basel, and she will look at the underlying conditions and what you can do to overcome this acceleration trap and how to actually manage your organization with speed and agility. Now I would like to welcome Heike. Heike, can you try to turn on your video? There you are. Hi. Welcome.
Hi, Friederike.
Thank you for being here with us. I will tune out and the stage is yours, Heike.
Yeah, super. Thanks for having me. Welcome from Basel. Today is about digital transformation, and this digital transformation is present almost everywhere. And probably I've also experienced that in this context, the role of leaders is fundamentally questioned. And that will be in the center of this webinar today. I will open the presentation for you now. Let me see. So we're already right in the middle. The presentation focuses on digital leadership and transformation, and in the subtitle I put my experience and practice. Some companies in that context speed up, whereas the majority seems to be overwhelmed and gets slower than it was because of the so-called acceleration trap. And the decisive reason for that is the kind of leadership that we have in those companies. I guide you forward to your questions. Let me have a look. What is going on in companies? I'll illustrate with some examples. It's remarkable about this digital transformation that it takes place in almost every industry. Actually, I'm not aware of any exceptions. For example, we see that in the media industry, and we are part of this fundamental transformation. We have that also in the health industry. You see fundamental changes taking place, and also the automotive industry, or one should better say the mobility industry. And all these fundamental changes are part of the digital transformation, and they are only possible if companies manage to also transform the way they work. So what do we have? Where are we coming from? Yesterday, work was more standardized, and companies were basically buying the hands of people. Today, we speak of knowledge workers, and we also buy the brains. Now, what we need in the future, that tomorrow is a fundamentally different way of working, and that is related to the so-called network organizations. And we have terms here like agile work, networks, new forms of leadership, self-organization. That is what we all experience, and you're probably also confronted with these terminologies. And we were now wondering at the University of St. Gallen in our Institute for Leadership and Human Resources Management, how far away is tomorrow? And we checked different studies reflecting on what is going on in the way we work, in the world of new work, as it was also called. And we put several of these studies together, and all of these show from different perspectives that tomorrow is not tomorrow, but we are right in the middle of this transformation already, in that new form of working. So you see the numbers, no matter from which perspective you look at it, we are right in the middle of that different form of working already. And I'm personally 100% convinced that more changes are inevitable, and they're coming fast. Now, we were wondering how well are companies prepared for all these changes. And I summarized the different results that we find with the help of one number, just to simplify it in my head. And this number is below 10%. Less than 10% of the companies feel prepared for these changes. So it's a very, very small group of companies that feels already prepared or that is already working successfully in that transformed way of working. And that is the bottleneck for the digital transformation. Let us understand more about these changes and then also the role of leadership in that context that explains why some companies are successful and the majority is not yet fully there. So I'll first start with you to say, what kind of changes are we going through? How can we describe them? And I draw on one framework that has been developed by colleagues from Fachhochschule Nordwestschweiz. And the starting point of that transformation is a so-called place-bound work. It's a traditional way of working. People work solidly on one side, they have fixed working hours, and we have very defined hierarchies, and everybody knows exactly in the org chart in which quadrant he belongs or she belongs. That is the starting point for the majority of companies. And now when we talk about this transformation that's going on in the world of work, we have the end point of that transformation, which we can characterize as the network organization, which is characterized by virtual work, project-based structures, so we have fluid structures there. Mobile, flexible work is the norm, so where people work and when they work is pretty much up to them, and far less regulation and bureaucracy. Now companies go typically through different phases, and I'll describe them shortly for you, and maybe as I describe it, you reflect already in which of the phases you find yourself currently, or you find your company at the moment. I'll ask you later exactly that question, so maybe reflect already whether you're phase 1, 2, 3, or 5. So you see the same starting point, phase number 1. And when companies start to go towards a network organization at the beginning, they start often with home office, but home office is an exception. So you ask your boss, can I come later on Thursday or work from home on Friday? And then he or she says, okay. Then comes phase number 3, and that is a really, really demanding, turbulent phase, and that is the only phase where you should never stop. You can go through it, but go fast through it because it is perceived as exhausting. That is the phase where companies start to experiment with different new forms of work. They give freedom to the people, but people feel not yet fully safe, and that is often perceived as stressful, as chaos, and not only for the people, for the team members, but also for the managers in that organization. That's typically seen as exhausting. Then comes number 4, and that is the phase when companies want to get back into control, and they start to organize the freedom. So there are bureaucratic roles, like how fast do you have to respond after getting an email, or how much time do you have to spend at the desk when you do home office. So it's starting to really get a little bit bureaucratic here, but you want to organize the freedom. And the decisive step from number 4 to number 5 is that you take bureaucratic roles out and you put culture in. So people develop the maturity to deal with that freedom, and you don't need to have bureaucratic roles to organize it and to get out of the chaos. So now I ask you, reflect on your working context, on your organization, and tell me in which of the phases do you find your company to be in at the moment? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And Friederike will give me the result, I hope, in a minute, so that I can start. Okay, about 8% are in the in the phase number 1, 30% is just starting. Oh, that is quite a large group. About 25%, a quarter of you are in the middle of that exhausting change. And quite a large group is in that flexible, in that organized freedom box, and 9% are in the network organization. So we have a very innovative crowd here. Let us compare it with some statistics about Switzerland in general. In red, you find on average the large organizations, and the green one, or dark green, HSG green, is small and medium-sized companies. You see that majority of companies, large companies, are on its way. More than 90% of companies are in the middle of that transformation. For small and medium-sized companies, you have more spread. There's a group of companies, 12%, that are in that first quadrant, or in that first phase. And we have network organizations already. And it's important to emphasize that a lot of companies are on their way, but not everybody has to start. New is not necessarily better. For example, for the 12% small and medium companies, it may make a lot of sense to stay exactly where they are because of their business model. For example, some restaurant doesn't do home office, yeah, so that is very good that people are working there, and they have also some defined working hours. So we see where we are. We see companies are moving towards the network organizations, but a lot is taking place in the middle of that process. Let us now move one step further. And now we come to our own research, namely, we didn't only look what is going on in terms of more modern versus more classical way of working, but we also linked it to the performance of the companies. So in one of our studies, we asked more than 19,000 people coming from 92 companies, and we're on the y-axis, we classified whether they are working in a more modern form or more in a traditional form, the companies. On the x-axis, we looked at the performance of those companies, and we looked in index classical performance indicators like growth or innovation or return on investment, and now I'll show you the numbers that we found. And we were, to be honest, I know the numbers already in, now about 2 years, a little bit longer already. We repeatedly look at those numbers and confirm them. At the beginning, I was quite shocked that only 6% belong to the so-called successful pioneers. 19% that is belong to the modern overstrained companies. They are overwhelmed by the new forms of working. They are stressed, and they are less successful than they have ever been before. So of all the companies that enter this new world of work, only a quarter of them is more successful. 3/4 of the companies that enter the new forms of work are less successful. They burn their fingers, they're overwhelmed, they fall into what we call the acceleration trap and go backwards. And that is something that really makes me concerned, because that is not what we should do. I'm personally convinced that we in the German-speaking world, we have no choice. We have to be much more modern than we used to be before. We need to open up, to be attractive, but you need to do it right. I don't want to experience that the majority of companies is burning their fingers and gets more conservative than they've ever been before. That wouldn't be good for the single company, but that would also not be good for our economy here in Switzerland and the German-speaking world. What I also have to emphasize is 30% of the companies belong to the classical high-performing companies. They're highly successful, although they're working in a quite traditional form. still. I show you some performance indicators here, and you see the classical high performers. They're a little bit more successful in terms of classical performance indicators, I have to admit. The successful pioneers are almost as successful in terms of these classical financials, but they are superior in terms of the currency of the future, which is innovation, customer, people retention, entrepreneurship, speed, agility, health of people. The more than overstrained, they have more negativity, they have exhaustion, they have the acceleration trap, they are far less agile and less fast than the others, because they're overwhelmed and they don't get it right. When asking how come that some companies speed up whereas others are exhausted and less successful than they used to be before, we found one decisive factor, and that is leadership. Let us have a look at what is currently going on in the area of leadership, new leadership. And what we find there is more or less a continuum from the classical form of leading people, the traditional. What is characteristic here? That most of the control is here in managers' hands. So they have the power, they have the influence. And in that process of the new work transformation, when we go towards new leadership, we give much more power and influence to the people, up to certain forms of leadership, like shared leadership, where leadership is a role that is divided in a team, or even leaderless organization. We have one big trend here, and that is get rid of the classical leadership. And you find a lot of these headings like, do we need leadership? Nobody needs leadership, or get rid of managers. So that is the big, seems to be the big trend here, that leadership is something we don't need. And this is completely wrong. Completely wrong, very dangerous, and that explains why so many companies fail in that digital transformation. What we need more than ever is really good, really strong leadership. What we don't need is something that is hierarchical, that is bossing, that is this classical in the sense of command and control. So quite a number of companies go now to that process of unbossing, get rid of hierarchy, get rid of top-down leadership, get rid of command and control. And there's one big risk that is taking place in those companies. Novartis is, by the way, one company that goes really in a very impressive process to that unbossing here. What the risk is, that those companies come from the traditional command control hierarchical, something that is so-called laissez-faire. There is no leadership. That is a vacuum. And of course, command and control is not ideal. You can find numbers and studies showing that command and control is not the most effective form of leading people, but the worst form of leading people. Traditionally, and even more so in a network organization, is laissez-faire. So that's the worst of all, and that's a big pitfall. So when we do unbossing, when we take away command and control hierarchy, instead of having a vacuum, we need to actively invest in establishing one thing, and that is real leadership instead of classical hierarchical management. And let me come here to one of the concepts that is very, very powerful traditionally already, and that is even more important in that new work context, and the successful pioneers are extra strong in those. It's purpose-oriented leadership. In that vacuum that we create, we want to put purpose-oriented leadership. And one classical leadership concept in this context is one transactional and transformational leadership. The ones that attended my lectures or even at the university, those must know that concept, of course, and I'll emphasize it here again, and for everybody who doesn't know it, I'll introduce it. It's the most effective form of leading people that is known worldwide. It's a combination of a classical transactional, more rational form of leading people and transformational, you could also call it inspirational form of leading people. Transactional is probably the butter and bread business of every manager. It's established in companies like goal agreement, performance appraisal, and then often performance-based bonus or pay. And that one, yes, we need to a certain extent, but usually we need it far less than we have it at least in established organizations. So reduce performance management, have it a little bit, give guidance, but don't have emphasis on that. Focus much more on what is called the transformational, the inspirational form of leadership. What you do here is be a role model, exemplary behavior. So demonstrate that it is meaningful for you personally. Inspiring motivation, give people purpose, give them a meaning, explain them the why, so that they identify with the common goal. Because imagine people work in a virtual form. You don't see them. You work in fluid structures with people you haven't seen before and you won't see for a very long time. If people are in a transactional mode and pursue just their individual KPIs, you're lost. Command control, you are lost. Laissez-faire, you are lost. What you need is, you need a common purpose, people who identify and go in the same direction, and you trust the other person is also going in that direction. And you need to have people who identify so much that they work hard when nobody looks at them. Also, intellectual stimulation and individual consideration, that so you make sure you inspire people and also support their personal growth. Let us have a look. I will ask you now, which of the leadership style prevails in your company? Is it more command and control? Is it laissez-faire? Is it more the transactional, KPI oriented? Or is it purpose oriented, inspirational leadership? Let's have a look. So, Friederike, show me some first results. I don't see anything here, I just see the question, but probably you have already voted. So our St. Gallen crew is working hard. Give me the first statistics here. Let me see. Oh, we have them. Command and control is 21%, laissez-faire 12%, that is far too much. We have 47 is in that bureaucratic, KPI focused form of leading, and only 20% in the transformational. So just to be very, very clear, the first three characterize a more counterproductive form of leadership. Transactional we can use a little bit, but certainly we need much more of the transformational. Otherwise, if you enter the that network organization context, you belong to the 19%, you burn your fingers, and you don't have the basis to actually let people go and trust them. So that is one very clear thing. Another one, a second characteristic of the new leadership thing, is that we have a far bigger spectrum of situations. And therefore, I will draw on a concept that has been called ambidextrous leadership. Ambidextrous means in English to be able to work with two hands. So Beidhändigkeit in German. So, and traditionally it means companies that have the ability to be efficient on the one hand and innovative on the other hand. And that concept can be also translated in the way we lead. And I want to encourage you in that new leadership, in that digital transformation context, to develop ambidextrous leadership and prepare on the one hand for a context that is focusing on execution, efficiency, delivery. And on the other hand, focusing on exploration, innovation, experiments, doing something new here. We have to develop that context together with our partner, Porsche Motorsports. And here it becomes very, very obvious that they always say in the racing, at the motorsports, there's no basic democracy. everything is focused on efficiency, on precision, on really keeping to the plan and perfection. You need a certain leadership that is very, very tough, focusing on that, avoiding mistakes. And of course, you have a very different leadership when it comes to the development of the cars, new technology, experiments, and here. What is wonderful is in the Porsche world, everybody knows why it is important to work in a different form and lead in a different form at the racing track versus at the vehicle development. And everybody knows that both worlds are equally important. What we currently see is a big movement towards the agile, towards very modern ways of working, experimenting, focusing on making mistakes in the garage and the entrepreneur, with declassifying the classical core business, and that's the racing track. What we need is two different forms of leadership, certain rules of the games and culture, and both teams knowing of each other, why it is important that they work in a different form, and of course a shared vision to jointly win the race, which is the transformational leadership, the shared vision, the purpose that we emphasized in the first thing. So we have certain characteristics of that kind of leadership. If you go back to the material, maybe you want to go also into the details. I would like to end with one thing, and that is a new mindset. And that are now results which we haven't published so far, to develop together with my colleague Sandra Bernbold, and a study that we conducted with the Bertelsmann Stiftung. What we ask here is, what are the preconditions for strong leadership in a modern virtualized context? And we found things that we expected, normal things like less bureaucratic structures and all this. One thing completely surprised me and still strikes me, and that is related to the leaders themselves. We found one construct that's called leadership motivation that has two dimensions. One is really the motivation to lead. Do I like to lead? Do I like people? Do I enjoy leading? Yeah, that's coming from the heart. And the other dimension, we called it courage. Am I convinced that I'm a good leader? And here we find that a significant group of managers is currently characterized by self-doubt. In a normal context, in a classical normal context, 36% of managers are characterized by self-doubt. In companies that go to fundamental new work transformations, digital transformations, this group raises significantly. And what is sad is it weakens the leadership significantly. And that is what we cannot afford. We cannot afford to go to some digital transformation and lose our leaders. So that has a lot to do with the mindset. I will draw on one example, like Otto Group, the executive board takes 1 day per month to reflect on their own mindset, on their own leadership, and also to exchange what is our new role, what is the way we want to lead, what threatens us, what weakens us here. So we need to invest in reflecting on the mindset, on the well-being of the leaders, and the way we want to interpret these different approaches that are characterized as new leadership. So that we need to invest in that, and I will close with that summary. So create the basis for successful new work transformation, first by new leadership, and second by a new mindset. So invest in establishing strong leadership. When you reduce hierarchy, when you do that unbossing, never fall into that trap of laissez-faire. New leadership, successful new leadership, is characterized to one thing that is purpose focus, and a second thing that is ambidextrous leadership. And the last thing is, so in that change, make sure you do the change together with your leaders in the organization, and you avoid as far as possible self-doubt. And that is something completely different than an open reflection, really self-doubt. I end with that example, or with that quote by Peter Drucker, and that is like a personal mission a little bit to you. Like he says, the first and foremost task of leaders is to take charge of their own energy, and then to help and orchestrate the energy of others. And that is like a personal mission in these turbulent times. Protect yourself, protect your own passion, your meaning, make sure you're in good shape, and then you energize the others for that change. I think of that quote quite often, namely, whenever I fly. And they come with the oxygen mask. I always listen to that when they say, hey, take care of yourself first and then the kids. And I find it brutal every time, but it is right every time, because they won't survive without you. And that's the same for that leadership. So take care of yourself, protect your passion, your meaning, make sure you're in good shape, and then you energize others for that transformation. Thanks a lot. So we'll come to your questions now if you want. Let me stop that presentation. You'll get it afterwards. Now, Friederike.
Oh, thank you, Heike. This was very insightful. I will scroll through the questions here. We have received the first questions. Remember, you can use the F&A or Q&A field to send us your questions, and you can also upvote those you find most interesting or most relevant. That makes it easier for me to select the best questions. So I'll take it from the top. What are the biggest failures organizations make on their journey towards new work?
Okay, I mentioned some of the failures that companies do with regard to leadership. That is primarily this laissez-faire. Yeah, and so getting rid of hierarchy and the classical command and control, and then having that vacuum and no leadership. I also mentioned that companies are so much in that agile fashion. I don't want to say they are so much in that agile transformation that that becomes very popular, and they de-emphasize the importance of the classical way of working when they are not ambidextrous. So that leads to that, almost admiration of the modern and agile working environments, whereas often the classical ones, efficiency, precision, are of course also very important, but they're often second class now in that new context. That is a typical failure. They then not openly discussing the requirements for that new form of leading. Every company needs to clearly define, hey, if it is not the old form of leading, this command and control, what is our way of leading in that digital context, in that new context? It shall not be everything is allowed. That creates those self-doubts and overwhelms people. So there are classical traps or mistakes related to leadership. We have also mistakes related to two other decisive success factors. One is culture. And here we see that some companies have that illusion that, culture transformation goes fast. We do it by new environment. We do it by different shoes, by beard, or any other form of visible changes. Often companies underestimate how important it is to take time, to go deep and establish cultural norms. Because we want to have bureaucracy out, we want to have culture in, and the culture norms need to be as reliable and tough as the bureaucratic roles. So we cannot just stay at the surface. And the third typical pitfalls related to the new competencies, we call them self-competencies that we found. And a trap is that companies choose a Darwinistic approach towards the new work transformation instead of clearly trying to find out what are the new competencies that we need, and empowering people, developing people on the way. They have the Darwinistic approach in the sense that they say, okay, the ones who make it are fine, and the others, can see what is happening. So 3 success factors: leadership, culture, and so-called self-competencies. And I mentioned the fundamental mistakes, or the quite common ones that we find.
Thank you, Heike. Maybe adding on to that, how long does it take from your experience to change the leadership culture? Provided it's done well.
You can change the way you lead relatively quickly by addressing certain symbols or artifacts here. That is really the starting point. And in a year, you can, in a larger organization already, create a different form of leadership. What is then important, so that it really becomes a culture transformation and not just a change pattern that you adopt for a year, is that you institutionalize it. So you emphasize it in the culture by saying, we consider it when we recruit people. So culture is relevant here. We consider it in the performance appraisal, so that it is not only important what you achieve, but also how. We consider it also in any kind of leadership decision with regard to promotion. Who's promoted, who's a leader, who becomes part of the executive board or the top team. So that's only when companies go into that stabilizing and make it part of their lived culture in the daily business, you can actually change the culture in the sense of the daily routines, the patterns. And then after 3 years, I think you have already changes. We typically, when we support the digital transformation or the new work transformation, companies also monitor these changes. And then you see, often you start at the top, and it, in the first year you see already the changes, but the decisive question is, do you reach all the management levels? All the management levels, and you reach it not only once, you reach it also when you stop the interventions or the classical change in it. That's interesting. So long breath, and also that commitment to real change, and not just this lip service, because at the moment companies feel they have to do it. That's, and in smaller organizations, of course, you can be much faster.
Yeah, some more questions here. The top one, I do understand the need of flat organizations and network organizations, but how does this reflect in organizational charts? Do you have any examples of organizational charts or principles to design the organizational chart regarding the network organizations? Quite a practical one.
Yeah. Often you actually paint it more like a network. So you have tribes or here. And what is important here, typically you don't have that classical org chart with that defined manager and being forever in that box as the manager. But in the network organization, you typically have different roles. And that role changes also over time. So someone can be the head of a tribe, or the head of a chapter or a squad for a certain time. And then it is very clear it is not for lifetime, or not always the case. It changes over time based on normal rotation or based also on competence. And that is, in that sense, also reflected when you look at the agile organization in that org chart.
Mm-hmm.
Also, org charts, I've seen also org charts that are very, very individual, because companies take the agile organization as a springboard and then come up with their own solution. And it takes quite a while to understand it from outside. For example, we work with a group of companies called Pioneering. There are 18 companies that is a consortium, and we support them with our research at the institute. And one of them, of these pioneering partners, is Swisscom. And Swisscom goes through that agile transformation already quite a while. And we support, for example, the transition of that HR community. And half of that HR community here is working in a more classical form. They're responsible also for contracts or employee relationships or apprenticeships or things like that. So they have a different chart. And half of it, about 60 people there, they have developed their own operating model. HR delivery circle, it is called, and it takes quite a while to understand how it works, and is a different org chart. And I love it because it is self-made by the people who live in it. And that is also part of their success. That it is not just a small group of people or consultants who have developed that and exposed it to them. No, they've said, hey, what are our goals? What do we want to achieve? And what are our preferences? How can we work best? And they have developed their org chart in it. And those two different worlds, they of course interact and live next to each other. It's what I also like is that they're do not consider it to be finished. Yeah, they say, hey, we start with this, and then we learn to live with it, and we also learn what we like and what we have to adapt. So a kind of living org chart, if you want, individualized and living. Mm-hmm.
Excellent. We have very few minutes left. I think we can take one or two more questions. There are a few about your the point you made about the self-confidence. Isn't a self-confident leader entering the overconfidence bias and start misjudging business cases?
Yeah. That one is I'm glad for that question, because that self-doubt versus self-confidence or overconfidence, that is actually two things that we have to separate very, very clearly. This overconfidence in terms of the solutions, I know exactly what the right way is, that is more the old school. I mean, this is exactly what we want to overcome. That's close to that hierarchical, and the boss has all the solutions. That is more related to the content. I feel superior, I'm overconfident, I don't need feedback. When we look at the self-doubt, then we address this question, do I feel I'm able to lead? And in those questions, we address the question, we ask people, do you think you can lead, or do you think someone else could be a better leader? Would you prefer to be an expert rather than having a leadership role? And people who question this are often so dense and so insecure that first they're prone to get burnt out, and second, they don't even doubt to be courageous leaders, to open up for the questions of others and get feedback and also go new ways here. So that one is really counterproductive. Self-doubts in the sense, not to be confused with openness for other opinions, and instead of overconfidence.
Excellent. Thank you for making this point, Heike. I think that was important. We have many more questions still open, but I think you touched many of the points already mentioned there. I'm sure people can also reach out to you after the seminar, after the webinar. Plus, of course, we'll send around a list of further resources. Give us some time. It will be next week or the week after, along with the recording and the slides. So thank you, Heike.
Cool. Thanks, Friederike, and thanks for listening to everybody.
Here in your virtual racing studio in Basel. And thank you to all the viewers. Thanks for joining us. And if you enjoyed this, there are 4 more webinars coming up this week. And stay tuned. We do more of those also in the future. So thank you very much. Do you have anything to say, Heike?
No, I actually enjoyed it. I thought it's. I'm from Berlin. I like a little bit the dialogue more than that, but maybe that is what is following. I hope you took something for your practice. I hope you feel inspired and you really go back and say, I want to make these transformations happen. Huh?
So, thank you, and bye-bye. Have a nice afternoon, everyone.
Nice afternoon.